Hi everybody, FIDE Master Dennis Monokroussos here. Today I'm going to take a look at a very high-level game played recently in the Biel tournament in Switzerland. This was between Alexander Morozevich and Morozevich-Shirov, and both players are very, very sharp guys. In terms of their style, I mean, of course, they're, I'm sure, also quite intellectually acute, but I'm referring to their style. I mean, both of these guys love tactical complications, getting these crazy positions, and you know, whoever comes out of the swamp alive is the victor. Before we get into this game, I wanted to mention probably next week I'll do a viewer games and questions show. So you might consider putting something in there. Now, if you guys put so much in there, then you know I won't be able to do everything at once. But there's not too much there the last month or so, month and a half. So if you guys have something that springs to mind, unless you're one of the people who's already got something on the queue, please do so. Okay, so let's take a look at this game. Morozevich had white. And so we've got a Queen C2 Nimzo Indian. And this line has become popular of late, this sharp pawn sack variation. And here, black generally plays E5. In fact, Morozevich faced this in one of those amber tournaments against Anand back in 2009. So in that game, well, here white has three moves to choose from. There's E3, which I think is the main move. There's B4, being greedy, trying to hold on to all of those pawns. And knight F3 is what Morozevich played against Anand. And alright, it's complicated, but since white never played B4, black was able to regain the pawn. And Anand was able to draw this. I mean, it's maybe a touch better for white. I mean, black has to do the proving here, but he's in good enough shape and held the game. So just a few more moves, so I'll show you the rest of this. Yeah, you can see black is certainly threatening nasty things. Rook E2 is winning if it happens, so white stops it. Black renews the threat. And now if queen takes D3, rook B to D8, and then rook to D2. So definitely you can see the need for real caution here. So queen D6 takes, and the draw is agreed here. So white's got a bunch of extra pawns, but they're not going to survive. All right. So in the game, in our game today, Morozevich against Shirov. Shirov played knight B to D7, and his idea is that if white plays E3, black doesn't have to bother playing E5 at all. So Morozevich played the principled move B4, holding on to the pawn and asking black exactly what he's doing. All right, H6. This is a good move, forcing white's bishop to choose a diagonal. If it goes to H4, then it takes the possible pressure off of the pawn on D4. So sometimes white could play bishop C1, bishop B2. So it just forces him, as I said, to choose. So he played bishop to D2, and now A5, taking some swings at the white queen side. One thing I should say, and I used to play both sides of this. Not this variation. It never came up. It hasn't come up in my play. But yeah, I used to play both sides of the Queen C2 Nimzo Indian somewhat regularly. And I would find that black's play would often come about because of the white king side. So if you take a look at it, you can see all these other things going on. But if you just focus on the little box here that constitutes the white king side, you can see that everybody is still at home. Nothing has moved. And this is often what gives black reasonable play in this opening. I mean, if white's white has a lot of assets in these Queen C2 Nimzo positions. The bishop pair, very healthy queenside structure, generally some kind of space advantage, but the king side, it's asleep. It's as if it's almost in a coma here. So black can very often rip the board open. And this goes back to something that I know I've said on more than one occasion when I've talked about the bishop pair. If you have the two bishops, it's not the case that you necessarily want to rip the board open as fast as possible. It depends on what's going on. The advantage of the bishop pair is a long-term advantage in most cases. You want to open up the board when you're good and ready to do it. Here, if white tried to open the board too quickly, he could get obliterated. And we'll see, in fact, black gets tremendous play here very soon. So white wants to make the position boring. He wants to keep things very normal, very uninteresting, finish his development, and then he can take over with his bishops and with that nice phalanx of queenside pawns. All right, so in the meantime, what's white going to do about the threat of a takes b4? Well, natural move, he plays rook to d1. Doesn't help his king side, but hey, we've got to keep things safeguarded over here. So a takes b4. Now here, kind of an interesting move that was suggested by Morozevich is bishop takes b4. And I mean, this looks kind of disgusting, leaving all three of white's queenside pawns isolated. But it's not so bad. It's not so bad. On e5, here white has a choice. So c6 is the obvious move, but it may not be so good because here, now the white queen side is just completely collapsed. The a3 pawn is falling, and you can see black's pieces are either well developed or about to be well developed, while white has no development on the king side. So this would in fact be very good for black. So the better move would be e3. And now, okay, if black preserves his rook from the exchange, then in this position, Morozevich thought that he would be in pretty good shape here, that his extra pawn, while not stunningly beautiful, would be some factor. Instead, though, he didn't like d takes e3, fe3, and then knight to g4. And here we see, again, the complete lack of white's kingside development becoming an issue. And if he plays queen d2, well, no big deal, queen g5, and white has no appealing way to deal with the threat to the e3 square. So I say the e3 square rather than the pawn, because he could push, but all the same, knight to e3 would be very annoying. So instead of this, Morozevich played a takes b4, not only keeping the pawns intact, but keeping the bishop around to cover the e3 square. Okay, well, what now for Shirov? There's nothing really to be done with b6. In that case, white would play c6 and then b5, cementing that pawn up there. So that wouldn't be very good. And in fact, then the black's bishop would have a very difficult time getting into the game. So e5. He's going to expand in the center. Maybe play e4 next, rook e8, knight e5, and so on. All right, now here Morozevich opined that e4 would have been the safer and normal move, with the idea of following up with bishop to d3 and knight to e2, and then he's well on his way to finishing his development and consolidating his extra pawn. So Shirov would have to take. Now f takes e3, e4, and here black certainly has compensation. Again, rook e8, knight e5, moves like that are coming, but white still has his extra pawn, and black will have to prove the compensation. In the game, Morozevich played knight f3, which is really provocative. Rook e8, and now e4 would be a bit late. Black would play knight to f8, and then bishop to g4, or bishop to d7. The bishop on d7 would threaten to go to a4, and black might even be better here. So Morozevich played g3. He's got to get his development finished some way or other. All right, now here black has a couple of very interesting ideas. One is to play knight to b8, which is a move that Morozevich was concerned about, but Shirov didn't even consider. So bishop to g2, and now here's a little quiz for you. So I think the game is very interesting in its own right, but it'll be more interesting if you guys get yourself involved. So first question is, what happens if black plays e4 here? So see what you can come up with in this position on black playing e4. Well, e4 is a very, very natural move, and it's a very powerful move unless white finds this. Knight takes d4. Well, isn't it undefended? Queen takes d4, but now bishop to f4. This is the point. But this isn't the end of the story just yet. After bishop to f4, the black queen is trapped, but he's got a dirty little trick, queen d3. Now if e takes d3 is check, black regains the queen. So white can at least play rook takes d3, e takes d3, queen d3. And here the material situation is very good for white. After, let's say, rook a1 check, king d2, rook a2, king d1, knight a6, bishop to d2. Here black is active, And as far as just the pieces go, it's not so bad. I mean, white's got a queen and a bishop for a rook and two knights, slightly in white's favor. But white also has 3 extra pawns. So this should be winning for white. Black is active, but not active enough to justify this really big material deficit. So after bishop to g2, e4 does not work on account of knight takes d4. So black should play knight to c6 here, castles, e4, knight e1. And this is certainly a position where black has good compensation. Obviously, those 2 pawns in the center are fantastic. It's not clear that black can break through, but he's at least in good shape. I mean, one idea is to play bishop g4, and on f3, just go back to h5, since white can't take on e4 because e2 would hang. So, good compensation for the pawn. Whether it's more or less than that, a little bit, I don't know. All right, so that was knight to b8. Very interesting idea. Shirov just went straight ahead, though. e4, knight takes d4, knight e5, queen c3. Okay, getting out of the way. I mean, black has a big threat here. Do you see it? Well, 2 threats. Queen takes d4 is 1 threat, but black has a 2nd threat. Knight to d3 check. Knight to d3 check is mate, except for the captures, but both captures would lose white's queen. So queen e takes d3, e takes d3 is discovered check, and then the queen drops on c2. So queen c3 takes care of that. Now if knight to d3 check, you can just take, and play bishop to e3, and it's a free piece for black. So knight f to g4. And so this steps up the pressure on some new squares, and also we can see the knight to d3 check idea comes back into play, because after e takes d3, e takes d3 check, bishop to e3, black can take on e3 and start driving the king out into the open. Okay, so that would in fact happen after bishop to g2, which is not what was played. Knight to d3 check, takes, and now, all right, a choice here. If bishop to e3, takes, rook e3. Okay, now if king f1, which is kind of cooperative, we check. Rook a2. So don't forget about that piece. That guy is going to be in the attack as well. And after rook f1, to stop queen f2 mate, queen e5, and white is probably just lost here. The number of threats seem to be around. One of them, well, yeah, rook to e2 looks like it should be decisive, if nothing else. d2 might even be possible here. Very bad position for white. So king f2 is a bit more feisty. But black has a very good move here. See if you can find it. Little tactics quiz for you. Okay, the winning move here is rook a3. And on queen takes a3, queen takes d4, and the white king will perish shortly. Rook e2 is coming in particular. So back here, instead of bishop to e3, white could also try king to f1. But again, black has a very strong move here that probably wins, or at least gives him a big advantage. Okay, if you guessed rook to a3, you are correct. Queen takes a3, queen takes d4, and what does white do? It can't play bishop to e1 because rook takes e1 check, and then queen takes f2 is mate, so I'll demonstrate this. Okay, so here, takes, and whichever capture, queen f2 is mate. Alright, if bishop to e3, okay, this obviously is a better try, but still, knight takes e3, f takes e3, queen takes e3. This looks pretty unpleasant. Let's say queen to b2 to stop queen e2 check, bishop to g4, and black must be winning here. So the threat is not just to take the rook, but to play bishop to e2 check. Also d2 if the rook moves away. That might be even better. So this has to be winning as well. Alright, so back here, white has only one move then, it seems, and that's bishop to e3 to block the e-file. So a very smart idea. Okay, Shirov takes, and now if queen takes e3, knight to d3 check. So again, this little trick. ed, bishop d3, takes, and bishop to h3. Materially, white's doing all right, but his king is still very unhappy. Can't castle. Rook a2 is coming. Queen f6 is coming. Queen g5 maybe instead. And so black is doing very well here. So Morozevich played f takes e3, which looks ugly, but you do what you got to do, and this keeps the e-file closed. Now here Shirov made a move that he was pretty unhappy with, and probably he's right that it was a bit of a mistake. So you might want to try to figure out what you would do here. So black to move, what to do. And it's not knight to d3 or knight f3 check, so just to get you guys off of that combination book kind of idea. So it's not like a black to move and win puzzle. It's just looking for the best way to start or to enter the next phase of the attack. So we had one kind of important transformation of the position with the pawn going on e3. So here you have to kind of take stock, calm down, stop thinking about the immediate killer threats with knight to d3, and figure out what next. Okay, well in the game Shirov played queen to g5, which is a very natural move. I mean, it's not only activating the queen, but activating it in a very concrete way. And now there are tricks with knight to d3, interfering with the queen on c3's protection of the pawn. Also, just the simple and straightforward knight to g4 might be possible. So it's a very logical move. It just seems to be inaccurate compared to the better move, which was queen to f6. So we'll take a little look here at queen f6. All right, couple of possibilities here. Or actually, I think I have three moves here. So let's say knight to b5 first of all, which makes a lot of sense. Threatens knight to c7, threatens perhaps to put a piece on d6. All very good, but black still gets his play. Rook to a2. All right, so this cuts off the king, and now there are threats like knight to d3 check, when e takes d3 is impossible because of queen to f2 mate. All right, so rook to d6. Now the king could move in theory, but well, can move after knight to d3, e takes d3. Though probably rook takes d3 would be correct there. However, there's an even better move for black. Rook a1 check. Queen takes, loses the queen to knight f3 or knight to d3. So king to d2. Bishop to e6, threatening knight takes c4 check. Bishop g2. Nothing better. Knight c4. Queen c4. Queen to b2. Queen c2, queen b4. Queen c3, rook a2. And then queen takes b5. So a long combination, but here black is much better. Material is even, but clearly the white king is not really very happy where it is. So after queen f6, that was knight to b5. A second line is h3, which makes sense, taking away the g4 square from white's pieces, from black's pieces, excuse me. But the problem with this is that now the g3 pawn is undermined, and now black can stutter step to g5. After king f2, rook a6 gives black a dangerous attack. If c6, then takes, and c5, well, that stops the rook swinging over to f6, but still after h5, black has a lot of play. All right, a third line after queen f6 is bishop to g2, hitting the e4 pawn, and hoping to play something like rook to f1, and then maybe rook f4 or rook f2, and scuttle the king over to g1 behind the rook. On this, black should play knight to g4. And on rook f1, play queen to g5. And now on rook f4, knight h2. And this continues the attack. And, of course, gains a pawn as well, which is nice. If king f2, then knight to g4 check anyway. If bishop takes e4, queen g3 check is just winning. And if rook takes e4, queen g3, king d2, rook a2, and rook to d8. And black has tremendous compensation. I mean, he's down a pawn still, but everything else is in his favor. So definitely a clear advantage for black here. All right, well, in the game, Shirov played queen to g5, which is, again, a very natural-looking move, but wasn't best. Bishop to g2, and here maybe knight to g4 is better, but he played knight to d3 check. ed, queen takes e3 check. All right, so now if the knight blocks, then bishop to g4, queen d2, e takes d3. This is very good for black, so black is happy here. But after king f1, it's a tough position. And here really is a key moment in the game, or at least, this is a place where black really needs to find something, because he's down a piece and a pawn here, and he's running out of time, running out of stuff. So what should black do? So here, definitely take your time, see what you can come up with. So I'll even flip the board around if that'll make it easier for you to get in the mood to look for good moves for black. So what should black do in this position? Okay, well, let's look at some options here and see if we can figure out what's best. If bishop to g4, which certainly looks very natural, I mean, we're bringing another piece into play, well, it looks like rook to e1 is good enough that white should be winning here. So bishop g4, it develops, but it doesn't really do anything to pose concrete problems for white. All right. Another interesting, or more interesting idea is rook to a6, to swing the rook over to f6. But white can play either c6 and block the line. I mean, he's up a piece and a pawn. He can certainly afford to be a little generous here. But maybe even better than c6 is knight to c2, with the point that on rook to f6 check, white can just take the rook because the black queen is hanging and has no good desperados or checks to get out of danger. If black retreats the queen to g5, well then d takes e4, and if rook f6 check, well, it just doesn't do anything. King to g1 and white is fine, and up a lot of material. So rook to a6 doesn't really work either. A very natural move here is rook to a2. But it looks like knight to c2 keeps everything sewn up as well. And there's no really clear way for black to proceed. But black has a very nice way of preparing that, and it's the move chosen in the game, which I'm happy to say I also found pretty quickly. Actually, I found it before the GM commentators saw it too, so, go me. They'll see more, but I see good moves sometimes too. And bishop to h3 is one of them, and it's what was played. The point of this move is that on bishop takes h3, rook a2, now if knight c2, queen f3, and the rooks are forked, and in fact black is winning here, crushing here. Okay, that's the key tactical idea that makes this work. Of course, white doesn't have to play knight c2, but if he doesn't have that resource, black is a bit happier. So for instance, if queen to e1, okay, queen takes d4. It's still a piece and a pawn, but the white king is really tied down here, and there's no clear way for black, or for black's attack to be broken. So the initiative goes on here. It's threatening to play e3 now, so white should play d takes e4. Okay, but now queen f6 check. All right, what does he do at this point? If bishop to f5, then queen to b2, threatening mate on g2. If we go back, then g6 stops bishop to f5, so queen f6 check becomes possible again. Also, maybe rook to e6 and rook f6 could be an idea. And also, still another idea, after rook to g1, there's rook takes e4. And if queen takes e4, queen f2 is mate. So white is now forced to give up the queen, but it's not going to be enough. Takes, queen f6, check, king g1, rook a1. And in this position, black should probably win in the long run. So he's going to win at least the c4 pawn, probably the b4 pawn too. And winning won't be easy, but certainly black can't lose this and has good winning chances. Okay, so let's go back a bit to here. We just looked at bishop to f5. All right, king to g1 is also possible. And here there are some interesting variations, but it probably leads to a draw. I think black's simplest way to go is queen f3, keeping white tied up, stopping bishop to g2, and threatening rook takes e4. So on this, there are a couple of ways that we can end up with a draw. So rook to d2 is one of them. Black's best is queen to c3, pinning the rook, which should go back, and then queen f3. White's second winning try in this position is bishop to f1, but rook takes e4, rook to e8, king h7, and now here's why it's a winning try, queen e4, and bishop to d3. Well, materially black is in deep trouble, but he's got the move, and with the move can hold. Rook a1 check, king f2, And now not queen takes d3, rook h1, which would give white a much better endgame. He's going to win. He's up a pawn, and when he plays the rook back to d7, there's going to be even more trouble. But black should just repeat with rook to a2, and that's an immediate draw. All right, so bishop to h3. We just saw that bishop takes h3 is very complicated, but doesn't give white a winning chance. Doesn't give white any winning chances. So queen to b2 was the move chosen by Morozevich, and this is a good move. All right, stopping rook to a2, which is really crucial. Okay, now bishop to g4 is better. Remember, bishop to g4 the first time was bad because of rook to e1. So let's go back to here. Yeah, bishop g4, rook e1. But now, after bishop h3, queen b2, bishop g4, rook e1 was played, but now black plays queen takes d3 check, and the play continues. Okay, king to g1, and now we have another critical moment where black has to find the best move. So again, take your time, see what you can come up with. Release your inner Mikhail Tal and see what you can find. All right, well, this time, surprisingly, Shirov went the wrong way and should have lost the game. The right move here is rook to a2. Okay, very clear and direct idea. Queen takes a2 is forced. Queen takes d4 check. Queen f2, and now e3. And white is up an entire rook here, but the rook is on h1. That extra rook is on h1 doing absolutely nothing. And in fact, in some ways it helps black by really, kind of shutting the white king. It locks the white king away from the corner, so that the white king is more vulnerable than it would be if there was no rook there. All right, so here queen f1. Okay, now e2 is pointless because of queen f2, but rook e5 is a good move, threatening rook f5, trapping the queen. So queen f4, queen d2, hitting the rook on e1. But not just that. If queen takes e5, queen f2 is mate. Okay, so h4. Now white is hoping he can squirrel his king off to safety and get that second rook finally into the game. At a cost, though. Okay, so black has gotten the rook back but lost the bishop, so it's still an extra piece for white. Despite this, black remains very much in the game thanks to this powerful passed e-pawn. Ironically, white's best is to again sacrifice big guys for little guys. Alright, so now the material situation is that white is still ahead in material. He has 3 pawns for the exchange, and those 3 pawns are those dangerous looking guys over on the queen side. But black can at least get rid of this, in exchange for which white again does some collecting. Alright, so after that long variation, we end up with this, where white is up a pawn, certainly has winning chances, but I'm not sure how serious they are. I think it's going to be very difficult for white to promote the c-pawn or to help the c-pawn advance while still avoiding perpetual. So I think white's king is going to have to come out. It's not going to be able to kind of hide over there in the corner if white hopes to push the c-pawn. So I think the king's going to have to come out and around. And in that case, though, then if black can grab one of the kingside pawns, you're going to end up with this race. Who knows what's happening here? So I won't even pretend to know if this should be a win or a draw. I don't think your computer's going to know either. Maybe a very experienced GM would have a better idea than I would, but certainly it's going to be very difficult either way. Okay, so the point though is rook to a2 makes it very difficult still for white. At best he reaches that queen ending with some winning chances, but that's it. Another idea that's interesting was suggested by Shirov, and this might not be so bad. Queen takes c4, bishop f1, and now rook a2. Again, remarkable. I mean, black can afford to do some trading here, even though he's down a piece for just 1 pawn. But the problem still, that rook on h1, it's not functioning. It's not participating. So h3 is probably the best to play rook h2 and get this guy finally into the action. Rook takes b4. And here, all right, if rook c1, then rook to d8 is a good move. Hg, rook takes d4. And now it's 2 pawns for the piece. The kingside pawns are doubled. Black has pretty good drawing chances here. In fact, I think a draw is the likeliest result. But here, instead of rook to c1, maybe knight to b5. So a neat little tactical shot. This might give white some serious winning chances, because now not only is h takes g4 threatened, but so is knight to d6. And knight to d6 follows even on rook takes c4. And there are also even tricks like bishop takes f7 check, and then knight to d6, and then knight takes e8, and so on. So white, I think, does have some genuine chances here. Well, in the game, though, white has all the chances after rook a to d8. Black is in huge, huge trouble. So knight to b5, e3, h3, and now what Shirov had missed when he chose rook a to d8 was this, that if he plays queen to d2, takes, he just missed knight to c3 somehow. And now it's just a win for white. Okay. Yeah, this is hopeless. So queen takes, bishop b7. And although black has managed to recoup that rook that he was down, he has no chance against the three queenside passers. So since he couldn't do it, instead of queen to d2, he had to play e2. And here, white could have won immediately. So we'll make this a little puzzle for you. What's the best way for white to consolidate in this position? How do we put the fire out on the board? Well, if you said h takes g4, then you're a bit too greedy. So a little greed in chess is good, but that's really asking for it. I mean, black plays queen takes g3, and the fight continues. So king to h2 is not a bad move. That's what Morozevich chose. But he could have just won immediately with queen to c3, offering a trade of queens. I mean, white's up a full piece here. And if queen takes, knight takes, when the bishop runs, then e2 is going to fall as well. So let's say queen to d1, as good or bad as anything else, and then knight to d6. So this closes the d file, hits the rook, puts the knight on a great square, and it's just over here. This is the end. So instead, Morozevich played king h2. Of course, there have been time trouble at this point as well. Shirov played queen to e3, clearing the way for the rook to come into the action. So Morozevich plugs up the file with knight to d6 correctly. And Shirov keeps the action going with queen to f2. All right, still trying to keep it going. I mean, he's down a piece, and he's got two pieces hanging, but he's going to keep finding threats. All right, so here you go. White to move. What should you do at this point? Okay, if you said h takes g4, again, you're probably mistaken. Now, the move for white here, or for black here, is not rook to e3, but rook takes d6 first, and now rook to e3, threatening, well, both captures on g3. Queen g3 and then queen takes e1 is great, and rook takes g3 is not so bad either. One idea with the rook on g3, so if you play rook takes g3, you can follow up with g5. Let me put some arrows here. So rook g3. If you play g5, then the idea is rook h3 check, king takes h3, queen h4 mate. So it's a nice little pattern to know. All right. So here, if queen to d2, this would be a blunder. It protects the rook against the queen g3, queen e1 idea. But after rook takes g3, rook h to g1. Here, not g5 because then king h1, but simply rook to a3 is crushing. There's no good defense to the threats of queen h4 check or queen g3 check first and then queen h4 check. So queen d2 is a blunder. All right, so what does white do here? So see if you can figure it out if you haven't already. Okay, the only good try here, I think, is to sack the queen with rook takes e2. Rook e2, queen e2, c5, queen g4, and now let's say rook to e1. And here it's a very, very unclear position. I mean, just on the straight material count, black is up a little bit, queen for a rook and a bishop. But obviously the white passed pawn, well, the d pawn is very strong, and of course if the b7 pawn falls, then it's really a big problem for black. But it looks like black can maybe just save himself with g5 here. All right, so the idea for white was to play rook e4 and consolidate the pawns, but black plays queen h5 check. Okay, let's say bishop h3, and now queen to d1. And it's very difficult for white to make progress while simultaneously avoiding either this d1 h5 back and forth perpetual, or perpetual on the d file. So if with queen d2, king goes back, queen d1, and so on, and trying to get the pawn. So you can stop the checks, but not get the pawn going, or get the pawn going, but not get out of the checks. So White's the one who's got the more dangerous chances here, clearly, but I'm not sure that they can really be converted. Okay, so h takes g4, while natural, logical, obvious, and so on, is probably not correct. So instead, Morozevich played knight takes e8. Why not? We're threatening queen takes g7 mate, so black has to play rook e8. Okay, so now what do we do? Well, again, stop and think, figure out what to do here. Okay, well, I think White has a win still, but he's down to his last one. I think after this, there's no more win. All right, h takes g4 is not a winner because of rook to e3, and this gives rise to the same position we just had, except here instead of having a pawn on d6, he ends up with a pawn on c4. So that's clearly easier for black to cope with. All right, so this should be a draw. All right, queen of d2 was chosen in the game. We'll see how this fares. But perhaps the simplest was queen to c3. And this one wins. So this is like what we just saw, but it's a much better version. Rook e3, the only move for black to try. I mean, if he retreats the bishop, then, well, if nothing else, where does he retreat it to, for one thing? If he goes to f5, then queen f3. If he goes to h5, then g4. And then the queen still goes to f3 next. So rook e3 is the only move, but now takes, h takes g4. And it's not rook and a bishop versus a queen. It's two rooks and a bishop versus the queen. And the e2 pawn is going to fall sooner or later. This is just trivial. So queen c3 was the move, and that would have, again, finished things off. After queen at e2, now it's not clear at all. So probably at this point, black should hold, although there's still some work to be done. So bishop f3, rook h to g1, rook e3. Now queen takes e3 is not the same thing. Black should probably hold this, so he can get rid of enough of the queenside pawns. He's going to take on b4 next. That's crucial, and this should be a draw. So Morozevich played b5, keeping that pawn alive. And now f5. Okay, so what should White do here? So again, a very interesting position. If White tries to go for that same thing that we just saw with queen e3, bishop f3, queen f3, and rook to g2, it's a better version. So now if queen to b3 or queen e3 or whatever, White's going to remain with good pawns. He's going to remain with a b and a c pawn, not with doubled pawns. But the problem is for White that black can play f4 now, which is giving him some extra resources. So g takes f4, queen f4 check, queen c4. And now, after all, he is going to get rid of one of those two pawns with an easy draw. So c6, for instance, and everything is going to liquidate. We'll end up with queen and two pawns versus two rooks and a pawn. All the pawns on the same side. Easy draw. Okay, so that's what happens on queen e3 here. Another idea is to play c6. Just going to push and wait and see what black can do to him. So b takes c6, b takes c6. Now, if you play bishop to e4 here, this is a mistake because of queen to d6, protecting g3, and it should win. So f4, we've got to go forward. G takes f4. And now, okay, again, not bishop c6 because that allows White to liquidate in this way that we've already seen. But here, bishop to e4. Okay. Now, be careful. Don't play c7 here because black is threatening queen to g3 check, king h1, and then queen takes h3 mate. So queen e3 is again forced. And now black throws in queen takes f4 check first, and then queen takes e4. And this is not quite as easy as the last one we looked at that was similar, because here White may be able to keep that c4 pawn, I think black can hold this, but I'm not 100% sure. So this at least is still a little bit interesting. This is not a done deal just yet. It's probably a draw, but not 100%. Okay, well in the game, queen to d4 was played by Morozevich, also quite logical. Black played bishop to e4, again threatening mate in 2. We've seen this before. And then Morozevich played queen takes e3. But there are alternatives, and we'll take a quick look here. So queen to e5 is the big choice. So bishop takes g2, rook g2, queen takes, king takes, rook takes, and who knew? Now we end up with the rook ending. So one of the remarkable things about this is just all the transformations that occur, where you go from being a rook down to a piece down. We saw lines where white ends up down the exchange but with pawns, queen versus 2 rooks, and here we end up with a traditional rook ending. Amazing, amazing game. All right. It's still very, very complicated. So c6, b takes c6, b4. Now, in the post-mortem, or the press conference, I should say, the players thought that c5 was the right move here. But this seems to be an inaccuracy. b7, rook e8, king f2, king f7, rook e2, rook b8, rook b2. All right, so in this position, obviously, white is better. But the question is, how does white make any progress? How does he break through here? Because it looks as if the position is completely sewed up. So they thought, for instance, that this position should be drawish. But white has a nasty little trick here. So he can play h4. All right, let's say f4. And remarkably, in this position, black is in Zugzwang and loses. So it takes a moment to kind of figure out what's going on here. But that's the case. If the king retreats someplace, then king takes f4, and then the king's going to go over and grab the h-pawn and win that way. So that's no good. Obviously, the rook can't move. And if king f5, then rook to b5, and the king is too far away from the c-pawn. And white will either take that pawn with check, or, again, if the king retreats, then king takes f4, and the white king will penetrate, grabbing one of the other 2 pawns and winning the game easily. So c5, I think, is a mistake. And it's surprising, though. I mean, it's the very most natural, most obvious and logical way to go. But rook to e4 is best, paradoxically trying to force white to play the move that c5 was intended to prevent, and that's c5. But now we play rook back to e5, b7, rook e8, king f2, so we play similarly. And now it turns out that the pawn is close enough that black can get there and be okay. Although, okay, in this position, black should probably play king e6, and this holds. Or he could play king e5 and g5. Again, the black king is not going to get pushed back. There's not going to be any Zugzwang. He can happily liquidate the king side if allowed, and then just play king d5, king c5 with an easy draw. So this could have been held. Also, instead here, after rook e4, if b7 straight away, again, should be a draw. Yeah, and black should hold this too. Okay, so queen e5 is not a bad try. I mean, this rook ending does have its promise. But objectively speaking, black should hold. All right, in the game, Morozevich went for this queen sack line. But again, f4 holds everything together. c7, takes, queen c4, and now white's c-pawn drops, black's e-pawn drops, and that's just going to be a dead draw. Okay, so an amazing game, really entertaining, but I hope also not just entertaining for you, but I hope you got a little bit of a tactical workout trying to solve some of these problems for yourself. So that's what makes games like this fun. I mean, is not just the entertainment value, but that when you try to figure out what's going on, I mean, you just get to examine all these cool variations and really get to kind of test yourself and test your fantasy as well. Well, I hope you enjoyed the game, and I'll see you next time. Again, remember, next week will be a viewer games and questions show, so be sure to submit that to the appropriate threads, which you can find in the training videos from the Masters section. It's on the top half, so the bottom half shows recent shows by me and others in that thread. But on the top half of that page, you'll see the submission links for those 2 topics. So by all means do so. Hopefully everyone won't overwhelm me. for next week, but it'd be nice to have a few more entries. Okay, thanks. See you next time. Bye-bye.